Okay, can you hear me okay out there? So I'm what stands between you and lunch. And I know if your stomach's rumbling like mine, but probably for different reasons, I'll try and make this as digestible as possible. It's great to be here, and thank you all for coming. I want to thank the National Academy again. I also want to thank the Weed Science Society for their leadership in pulling this together. I think this is a really interesting, and I agree with Ray, it's a wicked problem. And it's one that we haven't made nearly enough progress on, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is a dimension of it and an approach that I think has been neglected, and one that I think has to be part of the long-run solution. And it's something that you might ask, why is it? I'm an environmental economist, by the way, and you might ask, why is a respectable environmental economist up here talking to you about community-based approaches? Because that's Ray's territory. He's a sociologist. And I should tell you, by the way, that my partner in crime here is George Frisvold, who you just heard. And because there's really good economics involved in these community-based approaches, very important economic questions, important economic dimensions. In fact, we give Nobel Prizes for this stuff. In fact, we have recently, in the last 10 years, given Nobel Prizes for the economics of what we call this common pool resource management. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm really pleased to be here. I'm going to walk you through a few things. Here's the advancer right here. Got it. Okay, so the outline of what I'm going to talk about, and before I go all the way through that, let me tell you the major theme that I'm going to hit on, and it comes right off of what George talked about, is that it's distinctly possible that it's in the farmer's individual interests, and by the way, I wish we would have had them vote on case 1, 2, and 3. I would have loved to see your reactions to how many farmers do you think were in case 1, how many were in case 2, how many were in case 3. Because my feeling is that it's probably not case 1, or we wouldn't see that graph going up so sharply in terms of the number of resistant weeds. There's probably some economic disincentives for farmers to practice the good herbicide resistance management. And I want to talk to you about it. I think one of those disincentives may be that it's more than just the individual farmer that's involved in these decisions. It's their neighbors and people in the community as well that maybe have to be part of the solution. Now, I say this as a farm boy from Ohio. I was raised in north central Ohio on a very mixed farm with crops and livestock, and my father took great pride in never asking anybody how to run his farm. He was very self-reliant, very independent, and he was a good farmer, very good farmer. But I'm sure he could have learned something by talking to his neighbors. He just didn't like that. And farmers are like that. I don't know about you. What my experience was we didn't want to emulate the neighbors. In fact, we wanted to beat the neighbors. And I actually think sometimes we can do a better job by sharing information. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. That there may be in cases where we share information that farmers as a whole are better off. They may be able to make net gains by themselves, but they may be able to make larger net gains if they collaborate with their neighbors and with other organizations to implement approaches. So, with that, I'm going to talk to you about why we may need community-based approaches. I'm going to talk to you about some of the science that's been done on the design of these approaches, what works, what's necessary to make them work, what maybe make them problematic. Then I'm going to talk to you about 3 examples that are not, one is from herbicide resistance and weed management, the zero tolerance one, but some of the others that we've had great success in these community-based approaches. And we may be able to learn from those in order to bring this knowledge into herbicide resistance management. And then finally, I have a call to action. Some items there, I should say. And okay, the first question, before you get settled in here, keep you engaged, so don't think about lunch too much. How likely do you think it is that herbicide-resistant weeds will spread from one farmer's fields to another farmer's fields? Very likely, greater than 80% probability. Likely, more than 50%, but less than 80%. Can't say either way, even odds. Unlikely, less than 50% and greater than 20%. and very unlikely, 20% or less, or you don't know. So take a few seconds and answer that question. Oh, now that surprises me. But there is some science to support this. And there's also some data collected in responses that suggest that even if the weeds don't move, that farmers perceive that movement. And therefore, their behavior is conditioned upon that expectation that those weeds are going to. And my favorite example of this, I think I've got time for this, Harold. This is another farm story from my childhood, is when I was out and my father, we had this one field we planted in wheat, and the neighbor next to it also planted his in wheat, and he didn't control his thistles. And you could see those thistles blooming and all that seed, and the wind would start to blow, and my father just turned red. And the next year, sure enough, we had thistles in our weed field, all next to that field where that farmer was. So I think probably all of you have seen some of that. We know weeds move. We know the ecology of them. And they may move for different reasons, but that's an interesting response. Thank you. Okay. So why do we think that these community-based approaches may hold some promise? I've already told you that we may think they may be, if they're implemented correctly, they may be superior economically. So this has economic implications. We know, and we have some good science to suggest that there is significant weed mobility across farms in the landscape. We've seen that. It's been documented. We don't have enough good science. And these causes can either come from biological processes, what I just described was wind blowing pollen, and then the weeds kind of taking root in the fields, or they can be machinery, or machinery transported. I mean, what we have with this machinery all over the country now, harvesters being shipped from one state to another. Are they cleaned? Might they deposit seed in another state for what they picked up in a different state? I think we don't know enough about those processes. But if farmers feel their action will not be matched by their neighbors, then we got a problem. They basically have lessons that say, why should I invest all this time and effort in herbicide resistance management if my neighbor's not going to do the same thing? So it's an assurance. It's what we call an assurance problem. Individual decisions really depend upon those of the group. Now the question is, who's the group and what are their incentives? So sizing up the mobility problem, and you're going to hear this term again. So if indeed herbicide resistance is mobile, we think there's good reason to expect that because of the science and also some of the data that we have, then this susceptibility of the herbicide, of weeds to the herbicide, to effective control by the herbicide, is a resource that's shared in common. So what my neighbor does in terms of applying too much glyphosate may affect how effective glyphosate is going to be on my farm. If that's true, that's what we call a common pool resource. That means everybody's decisions affect that susceptibility of those weeds to the herbicide. So here again, we need more research on this to document this. My guess is, and this is one of my favorite, my students always said I use this as an out, but the question is, how important is this? And I'm going to tell you it's two words. It depends. It really depends upon the region. It depends upon the crop. It depends upon the situation involved. That's why we need more research to document this, how far it spreads, how frequently it spreads, what's the effect, and what have you. And I think that's a huge, for you academics in the room or others, government scientists, this is an area that really needs to be researched more. Okay, so don't try and clean your glasses. That's a fuzzy picture. But the point here is that farmers can share information, and they may want to share information about the nature of their weed problems and how to attack those. And the more they do that, likely, the more they share information, the more likely they're going to be effective in finding really cost-effective and sustainable approaches. So this is what Ray was talking about, using that experiential knowledge of the farmers who come up with ways to really effectively manage weed resistance that maybe we didn't think about as scientists, because sometimes they are in front of us. I agree with Ray about that. I can remember when I was at the University of Missouri, Columbia, there on the faculty in the College of Agriculture, the person who made the first chisel plow, conservation tillage, and he made it in his garage. Well, the ag engineers were wondering, what was that guy doing? Well, he ended up making a pretty important piece of equipment that then got widely adopted. Okay, so why might we prefer community-based approaches? There's a couple of really good reasons. One is we think, for all of those in the room who think top-down command control regulation is the way to solve this problem, I have a feeling there aren't many here. Some of you may think that, but we, at least in other areas of environmental management, we've found that those approaches are often have some real significant disadvantages. They generally involve higher costs. They're generally not as sustainable. They lack flexibility, and that increases expense. They often, if we specify the kinds of, just for example, think about going out to the farmers and saying, here's your menu of herbicide resistance management practices that you must implement. And if you don't, we're going to come out and fine you. That's top-down control, command control management. Do you think that's a good idea? That's a rhetorical question. I don't have one in there to answer that. But I have a feeling a lot of you don't think that's a good idea. And I don't either, because I think what it does is often it takes away the innovation, the urge for innovation, and we want that. And it also involves a lot of monitoring and enforcement costs. This is what I call the weed police. So do we want weed police in the fields looking at these and trying to find out if, in fact, if you're complying with your command? So there's another problem with this, and this doesn't just apply to regulation. This applies also to subsidizing practices. Often, and I used to work in the Department of Agriculture, and it's a wonderful organization, right? Done a lot of good. And often we provided subsidies for farmers to adopt conservation practices, okay? Remember the Conservation Reserve Program? Well, we still have it. And we provided subsidies, didn't we? For farmers to retire land, take highly erodible land out of production, put it in pasture or non-crop uses, something like that. Well, it turns out, and we analyzed this at the Economic Research Service, there was a lot of inefficiency with that approach. At first, especially. Now, it's gotten much better over time. But we ended up giving a lot of money away. We paid, and I should confess here, we actually had a field on our farm in Ohio that went into the CRP. Okay, so that's confession. But we actually paid some people to do things they were going to do anyway. And that's the problem sometimes you have with subsidies, is you end up paying people for things that they're going to do, and you're wasting money. And they just become these income transfers. We don't need that. Money's too scarce, money's too valuable. So what do we know about community-based approaches? What can we learn from the experience and the theory, both the theory and the experience of these? As I said, there's scholars who have studied these for a long time to try and decide when they work and when they don't work well. And I think we have here 8 design principles that I want to talk to you about. One is we must be able to clearly define the boundaries of the problem for these things to work. You got to decide who's in the community and who's out. If you can't decide that, you really can't implement an effective design and implement an effective mechanism to make sure the community works as a whole. Because if somebody is out that should be in, their behavior is influencing the resource, and they're not perceiving their role and acting upon it. So the other big lesson that comes out of this is in design principles that rules must be adapted to the local conditions. So this is all about making sure that those local conditions are taken into account. Ray talked about this, and I think George did as well. There's a lot of heterogeneity out there in all kinds of respects, in natural resource conditions, in social conditions, what have you. The farmers should be the ones who are using the resource, must participate in the decision making. In fact, I would just go so far as to say they must really be in charge of designing the decision making process. Those are the ones that work the best. There must be effective monitoring that is accountable to the farmers using the resource. We're going to talk about some of that in just a moment out in Arizona in terms of the cotton, BT cotton. There must be graduated sanctions for rule violators. So if somebody screws up and doesn't control their weeds that are spreading herbicide resistance to other farmers, they must face the threat of sanctions. These have to be credible, and they have to bite in order to influence people's behavior. And this is what's been done in a lot of these community-based approaches. Farmers will actually implement themselves these kinds of things because they know their welfare depends on what everybody in the group is their behavior. There must be conflict resolution mechanisms that are cheap and easy. The community must be granted by some, in this is case, if they need statutory authority in order to form these community-based organizations, that must be the legislature can act in many states and say, we grant you the ability to form this association, to manage this resource. That can happen. And often there are multiple layers of the organizations that are going to be required in managing this. We saw this, and we're going to talk about just a moment with one of the programs, one of the examples we're going to talk about. So the second question, get ready. As a general rule, what percentage of farmers in communities experiencing herbicide resistance do you think would participate in a community-based approach? 1, 20% or less. 2, 21 to 40%. 3, 41 to 60. 4, 61 to 80. More than 80, or don't know. Okay, you got 5 seconds? 10 seconds. All right. That's a nice district. That's almost more than 80, not there, that's for sure. That's a nice kind of distribution. I can almost draw a normal shaped curve around that. That's interesting. Good. And there's a lot of variation. So, and we don't know the answer to this. This is what, so this is really important data. Thank you. And I want to encourage all those you out on the webcast to make sure you submit your answers, as Harold said, so that we can assemble those and add those to these and get the true distribution. Because I have a feeling we have, I wouldn't say that you're a biased sample, but you're a selected sample here in the room. And we want to make sure we bring all those people in from the webcast to give us their views as well. But they're very interesting. So, but there's obviously a significant portion of you who think there's a lot of people who might contribute or might participate in these community-based approaches. Okay, here's a few examples that we have. One is from, and this is where George, if there's any questions, I'll give them to George. He's done really great research on this down in Arizona about the BT cotton. This is for insects, because of course we know insects move, right? And insects mobility is a huge problem with that, and that's been recognized for a long time. So Arizona's had this BT cotton working group. And this is here's the area-wide approach where the growers, University Research and Extension, USDA, EPA, all of them come together in industry to try and work on this problem. Because they realized that this was threatening the future of the technology. Okay? And it was very important there was a two-way flow of information to and from the growers. Always, and continued monitoring is very important. What they found is that good data on the gains from BT also show benefits of managing resistance. So you have to document the benefits of in this case, an insecticide, in order to show, well, if we lose it, what are we losing? What are the potential gains? Also, they found there was the possible to increase the effectiveness and lower costs of regulation at the same time through information sharing. Makes common sense. But by the way, information sharing is not costless. It takes time, it takes resources, and it takes ingenuity to figure out how to share that information effectively. And the other big lesson, as George will tell you, is that this is not over. Managing resistance never ends. It's a continuing process. For those of you who are, backgrounds in ecology, and you know what the story is there. Zero tolerance for Palmer amaranth. And I think, is Jason here? There he is, great. So if any questions, we're going to ask Jason. Jason Norsworthy, who's working on this, maybe others here as well. But here's a program on weed management that I think has some of the properties of community-based approaches. And what they found, and he's published on this, and we've used that in forming this presentation, the importance of rapid information exchange between the grower, the extension, the personnel, and the researchers. Really important. So again, you're getting that same message. Information exchange is huge. Continuous testing and evaluation of these approaches is very important. Science-based rules. Of course, we all want to have science-based rules as much as possible. And it requires that you look across commodities, so that, because these weeds don't respect crops, they can go across commodities, and a cross-commodity approach, and then looking beyond individual farmer fields, because as we know, as we just talked about, there can be mobility. So, some general lessons here, wrapping up. Although, get ready, don't put your clickers away. If-then statements based on scientific information showing economic consequences. Again, here comes that economics again. Economics rules. I'm an economist. More effective than exhortations to what people should do. You have to have good economics that underpins this to convince people what is in their interests. That's not the only thing, but that's important. Exchange of information is crucial. Multi-directional versus unidirectional. It should be flowing in multiple ways, and listening is underrated in these things. Sometimes we talk too much. Well, I used to have an extension appointment as well, like Ray and like George, and so I know that I often listened when I went to farmer groups, because they shared things with me that really helped me understand the nature of the problem. And then building, and this is very important, this is where the community-based approaches comes. Building institutional capacity takes time and requires maintenance, even after the crises subside. So this is where, building that culture, I don't know if Jason wants to, I'll invite you to comment on that, Jason, afterwards. It takes time to build that network of relationships so that people feel free that they can participate effectively and that their views will be taken seriously and will be listened to. So, last question. I want you to select the 5 options that you think. Now, 5. So you have to press your thing 5 times, but before you press anything, let me read them. But after you press each one, press send, and then go to the next one and hit that and press send. Is that correct? Right? Good. Okay. So, first one is that will be the most effective in resistance management. We want to know what are the 5 things that you think will be most effective. One is federal regulations directing how and when and where herbicides may be used. So this is command control stuff. Okay. 2, extension grower education programs. 3, federal stewardship payments to encourage resistance management. 4, industry incentives. We already have some of these programs providing rebates for resistance management. 5, reduced crop insurance premiums for adoption of resistance management. 6, grower-led community-based resistance management programs. 7, more information on herbicide labels. 8, increased research into non-chemical methods of weed control. There's something here for everybody. 9, increased economic incentives or lower regulatory barriers to developing herbicides with new modes of action. And 10, faster approval of seed varieties with multiple herbicide-resistant traits. Okay, you're on the clock. How much time do we give them? Great, you got 20 seconds. Press 5 times and press send after each one you press. I'm really looking forward to this. This was George's idea, by the way. Oh, interesting. Huh. I'm surprised again. This is great. And to make sure all of you out on the webcast, make sure you send your responses in so we either can tally those and add those to these. But we see a pretty good distribution here. Federal regulations got 20%. Huh. That surprised me. I didn't think that would move off the needle. Yeah, we actually have some. Okay. More informative. It doesn't sound like labels are going to solve the problem according to what you think. And some of these increased research. Okay, great. Thank you. Now, in closing, we have 3 calls to action. We think there is merit in pursuing these community-based approaches. Definitely, there is merit based upon experience from other activities and just in good theory and good science. One is we want to solicit recommendations for candidate community-based approaches to herbicide resistance. So if you think you have an idea, and I'm going to invite this, Harold, if it's okay, if you have an idea, you think there'd be a great example, a pilot, if you will, or an experiment in trying to form one of these community-based approaches, let us know, okay? And then we're going to select 1 or 2 areas to initiate these pilot community-based programs. We already have some ideas in mind. I won't say those right now. But we want to work with groups to see how this might work, how effective it might be in really changing behavior. And then, of course, we have to study what worked and what didn't. And learn from that. Because this is really, and this again goes back to a point that Ray made, is that this is an exercise in adaptive management. We're not going to solve this. There's no single solution. These things are going to have to be tailored to individual conditions and fit in the context in which they're placed. So with that, I'll say thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Nick. And I cannot imagine that there will not be some questions or comments based on this presentation. So we've got about 15 minutes before lunch, so let's take good use of that.